So welcome everyone to the fourth training session offered by the Community Tree Nursery Collaborative, or CTNC for short. Safe and sound in the ground. Lovely to see you all. I'm Hilary and I work for Fellowship of the Trees and organise the events for the CTNC. So for those of you who are new to the collaborative or to these events, I'll just introduce it briefly for you. It's a peer-to-peer learning network that enables community tree nurseries in the UK to share good practice and discuss common issues and challenges that arise when setting up and developing a community tree nursery. So also there's the overall aim to build community between those involved. On to tonight's session, which is all about tree health, biosecurity and the UKISG scheme. We will invite questions from you all after both speakers have finished. So I suggest that you use the raise hand reaction on the panel to indicate that you wish to ask a question. Obviously, feel free to write in the chat as well, but it's just a little bit easier to manage if there's lots of questions with the raised hands option. So obviously after both speakers have finished, we will move on to questions and discussion. So our first guest speaker, Alisha Anstee, is the lead policy advocate for tree health, biosecurity and invasive species at the Woodland Trust. I'd like to welcome you now to the CTNC and thank you for being here.
Thanks, Hilary. Hi, everybody. It's so good to see so many people joining. Sam, are you able to share your screen with the slides, please?
Yes.
Yes, thank you for joining and spending your evening listening and learning about biosecurity, hopefully, and UKISG, amongst other topics. I think it's really timely, actually. You might be aware that it was Plant Health Week last week, and this week is actually Invasive Non-Native Species Week, so both very relevant to these topics. And I'm not sure if any of that sort of comms reached you last week, but yeah, it's a very important topic that I hope you all go away learning something today. Bit of background on me before we start. So I've been at the Woodland Trust for about 6 months now. It's the UK's largest woodland conservation charity, and I am the lead policy advocate in tree health and invasive species and biosecurity. Previous to that, I was doing another policy role at the National Farmers Union, and prior to that, I was studying environmental science. Next slide, please, Sam. So I'm hoping this talk will last just over 20 minutes, all being well. So we'll go through sort of background to pests and diseases, what the big deal is, why we should be worried. I'll briefly touch on future threats, then wider biosecurity, so what you can be doing as an individual to sort of make the world a bit more biosecure. I'll talk about Woodland Trust action, so what we're doing as an organisation, including our UK and Ireland sourced and grown scheme. And then I'll briefly mention Plant Healthy, which you may have heard of. It's an accreditation scheme. And then we'll finalise and summarise and take away messages. I'm happy to share these slides as well, so please don't worry about frantically noting anything down. They can be circulated afterwards. So what the big deal is, our woodlands survive and thrive in a really delicate ecological balance. And when this balance is disturbed, it can lead to really catastrophic impacts. We've had lots of examples that I'll come on to later where this has happened. Really important to note that we often separate out pests and diseases to invasive non-native species, though we shouldn't, because a lot of the serious tree pests and diseases are also invasive non-native species. So they're defined, as species where their introduction or spread outside of their natural range has led to negative consequences, such as threatening biodiversity, or it could have other unforeseen impacts. They are actually the biggest driver globally of species extinction and biodiversity loss. And just to put this into context, in the UK alone, we spend about 1.7 billion managing the impacts of invasive non-native species. So it's a really, really important topic. And important to note also that once a species has become established here, or anywhere, in fact, where it isn't meant to be outside of its natural range, it's really difficult, near impossible to actually eradicate them. So the focus really needs to be on prevention here rather than cure. So this is a timeline taken from our State of UK Woods and Trees report that was published last year. Now, if you haven't read it, I would really strongly recommend you do. It's got a really broad scope. It touches on so many different topics. Pests and diseases is one chapter, but it's a really, really useful report to get a feel for the state of our UK woods and trees at the moment. So this is a timeline of the instances where pests and diseases have been found in this country on certain host species. And you can note from the incident, that it's becoming much more common. And in fact, since this timeline was published last summer, we've had 2 further pests and diseases that this needs to be updated with now. So that really highlights the rapidly evolving situation that we have with pests and diseases. If you could click onto the next. Brilliant, thanks. So this increase in occurrences has been noted alongside an increase in the value of trade of tree imports from the EU and beyond. So this has occurred alongside those pests and diseases arriving. We've had an increase in the value, so that is trade in millions of tree imports. So we have sort of developed an international international model of plant trade in this country, and it's become really reliant on us importing trees because it's more cost effective to actually import them in some cases than it is to grow them here. So that's a real worry because imports carry such high risk of inadvertently importing pests and diseases. So one of the major Woodland Trust sort of aims is to reduce that reliance on imports so we can mitigate some of that risk associated with them. And just to give you a recent example, earlier this year, so in February, we actually, there was an interception by government on the pine processionary moth, which isn't currently established in this country, but that was found on a number of imports from a nursery in France. And luckily that was found quickly and government were able to act, and they believe they're on top of that and it's not in the wider environment, but it really does just highlight the risk associated with imports. So those consignments that came through with pine processionary moth were able to sort of penetrate through our border controls and actually arrive in this country. Next slide, please, Sam. So just going to quickly go through 2 examples here. Now, I'm sure you've all heard of Dutch elm disease. This is one of the most serious tree diseases in the world. It actually initially arrived in this country in the 1920s, but that strain didn't cause catastrophic impacts. A different, stronger strain then arrived in the 1960s, which then led to us losing about 90% of our elms. So that accounts for about 60 million elm trees that have been affected by this. And really the only ones that were able to survive were those in hedgerows. So before they get to a certain size, it's thought that the bark beetle doesn't really take hold on the trees. So that's really the reason why the hedgerow species were able to, hedgerow trees, were able to survive. And whilst there is some hope of rebuilding elm populations, we will never see pre-epidemic numbers that we saw before. So that's had a lasting impact on our landscape. I'm sure there are some people on this webinar that remember a time where elm were really common across the UK, and now it's sort of a rare sight rather than them being a really common tree in our landscape. The next example is the ash, which arguably is the most well-known tree disease. So I'm sure you've all heard of ash dieback in some way. And the ash is one of the UK's most common tree species. It's suffering currently and it's ongoing from the fungus that causes ash dieback. And it's particularly timely this year because it's 10 years since the fungus was first officially identified in a nursery in Buckinghamshire. And whilst we can't say for sure if ash dieback arrived on tree imports in the first instance, we do know that ash trees were heavily traded across Europe in the early 2000s, and there are examples of where ash imports were found with ash dieback. So if it wasn't in the first instance, then it certainly sped up the way that ash dieback took hold across the whole of the UK, because there's some evidence to suggest that this could actually blow over from the continent. But we do know that some consignments were imported with this fungal disease. So hopefully, all being well, the tech should work here and we should should have some questions pop up on a poll, because I'd just like to sort of get a feel for how many tree species, you think the ash tree supports. And of those, which species sort of entirely depend on the ash tree, and then the cost that you think is associated with the ash dieback in this country. So hopefully, Sam, if you click the poll should come up for everybody.
Unfortunately, the poll option isn't working, so I'd have to ask people just to put their questions in the chat, if that's okay, their answers in the chat, if that's okay.
Yeah, okay, no worries. Okay, so the first question, I don't actually have them written down, but I'm going to have to try and remember this. So the first question is, how many species do you think the ash tree supports? So if you could pop your sort of thinking in the chat, and then we can get a feel for what people. Okay, so we've got a lot of different numbers coming through. Some good estimations here. So the second question is, because if Sam clicks on the next slide, all the answers are revealed. So I won't actually tell you until I've asked the second question and then the final one. So the second question is, of those species, how many do you think are entirely dependent on the ash tree? So should we lose ash from our landscape, how many species would become extinct? Okay, if we stop inputting now, and I'll ask the final question, just so we can know which responses are relevant to which questions. This final question is around the cost associated with managing ash dieback in the UK alone. So between 2020 and 2030, how much do you think ash dieback has cost? And that cost includes sort of the direct felling costs, restocking costs, but also the cost to the ecosystem services that we will lose because of those trees needing to be felled or dying. Some really good responses here, actually. Some people are estimating really close. Okay, I'll pause there. If we stop now, and you can reveal the answers, Sam, by hopefully clicking. So 953 species have been identified in a recent study as being associated with the ash. Of those, 44 are obligate species. So without the ash in our landscape, those species would not be able to survive. And of course, what that means is it would have other implications on other species that are reliant on those. So there's sort of a cascade extinction effect here by losing just one tree from our landscape. And then finally, so it's estimated in a 2019 really comprehensive study that the cost associated over 100 years will be 15 billion. So that's 100 years from 2020. However, half of that cost, so 7.5 billion, is expected to be realised in just 10 years. So that takes us to 2030. So there's enormous cost associated with tree pests and diseases. And as I've mentioned before, enormous risk with imports. If you want to click onto the next slide. So I won't go through these in much detail because I don't have too much time, but just some pests and diseases that are being managed currently across the Woodland Trust estate. Obviously, I've mentioned ash dieback. We've also got Dothrostoma needle blight, which is a fungus that causes premature needle drop. We've got Phytophthora ramorum, which is a fungal-like organism that causes the death in lots of different tree species. And this particular Phytophthora as a category was responsible for the potato blight. We've got oak processionary moth, which is a defoliate of oak trees. And if you're in London, you've probably heard of this. We currently have it sort of established in the London area, but it's contained. We've got sweet chestnut blight, which is again a fungus, and it's usually fatal. And then we've got oak declines, which we don't know too much about at the moment, but they do leave oak. It's usually, we think that it is due to oak trees being stressed by a number of different factors that's leading them to decline. We do have more information on all of those plus more pests and diseases on the Woodland Trust website if you are interested. So future threats, not only have we got sort of existing pests and diseases that are here that are causing havoc on our woodlands, we've also got a number of other pests and diseases that could cause catastrophic impacts if they were to arrive here. So this is the emerald ash borer, which is currently, it's a wood-boring beetle causing severe impacts in USA and Canada at the minute. It's currently spreading through Russia at a rate of about 25 miles per year. So if we continue with the status quo, it's sort of inevitable that it will arrive. And there is some hope of ash trees becoming resistant to ash dieback and us being able to rebuild the population due to the losses of ash dieback. But should this arrive, that would sort of quash any ability for us to rebuild our ash populations on the back of ash dieback, because the emerald ash borer would then take hold on the lasting ash trees, and we really would lose ash from our landscape forever, and then have impacts on the species that we've just spoken around. So this is a really important sort of pest that we really need to prevent arriving at all costs. Next slide, please. So, just to visualize the impacts of that pest, this is a street of ash trees that are healthy in Ohio, in America, and the same street was pictured 3 years later after the arrival of emerald ash borer. Now, those pictures are the same time of year, so you can really see the impacts in just a matter of years on those trees. It's totally decimated them, and we'd have similar impacts, we would imagine, if it arrived in the UK. So it all feels a little bit overwhelming. There's a lot of risk, and it seems that pests and diseases are really worrying, which they are, but there are a number of factors that we can all implement that would make the world a more biosecure place. So firstly, boot washing. If you're out and about in the countryside and you've been in a woodland, for example, and you're going home or you're going to another site, just make sure that you're washing your boots. That can be as simple as just with water, just rinsing all the mud off your bike tires as well if you've been on a cycle, and off your clothing too, or car tires. If you know you've been in a woodland that's sort of dealing with some sort of disease like Phytophthora ramorum, then it might be worthwhile carrying some disinfectant. So you can, if you are aware that you've been somewhere that's contaminated, you can just spray it with something like Clean Kill. The second sort of call to action is responsible sourcing of trees. So if you have land or you've got a garden and you're buying trees, make sure you are doing it responsibly. So I will come on to the UKISG scheme that Woodland Trust run later, but this is particularly relevant for a lot of you that are on this call, probably if you're involved in community tree nurseries, because you'll already be sort of implementing UKISG without realizing it. So you'll be growing trees that sort of carry a lot less risk than imports anyway, which is brilliant. And then it's also relevant to responsible sourcing of plants. So if you're a sort of houseplant fanatic, make sure you're responsibly sourcing those, and buying British where you are able to, and just having conversations with nurseries around their biosecurity, looking sort of for biosecurity credentials on their walls. And if you can, just grow some plants from seed as well. Try and do that. That would mitigate some of the risk. Finally, just remain vigilant when you're out and about. We do have a really helpful resource in this country, and it's Tree Alert. So if you're out and about and you see something on a tree that looks like a pest or a disease that you think is a bit sinister, then you are able to take pictures of that and send it into Tree Alert, and somebody from with expertise from forest research will take a look at that. Do have a quick Google before to make sure it's not something that we already know about, or just something as simple as the tree being sort of a bit unwell because there's not enough water or something like that, so that we're not wasting Tree Alert resources. But if you do think it's something that's a bit sinister, or you just need to find out a bit more, then that is available to everybody, which is great. Next slide, please. So what we're doing as an organisation, we do a lot of policy advocacy. My role is focused on policy. So that's all about influencing government, trying to influence policies and consultation responses that will make the world more biosecure. We also fund a lot of research on tree health. We have really great resource, as in the Woodland Trust owns a lot of woods themselves. So we practice what we preach. We demonstrate how we do things on our estate. UK and Ireland sourced and grown, which is the next slide. We also put out website content and position statements. We are involved in a lot of things to do with the media. And so we do a lot of sort of quotes, responses to things in certain newspapers, as well as sometimes featuring on the news talking about tree health as well. And finally, we are a significant partner in Observatory, which is sort of a network of volunteers on the ground that look out for tree pests and diseases all across England. And then Action Oak as well, which is a collaboration of partners that are looking to really protect our oak trees, and that partnership funds a lot of research too. So we're involved in a lot of things in the space. If you want to click to the next slide, please, Sam. So UK and Ireland sourced and grown. This was birthed on the back of Ash Dieback, actually. Woodland Trust sort of realised that they needed to do something to make sure that the trees we were planting, we could have confidence that we weren't inadvertently importing anything. And we were doing everything that we can to make sure the trees we were planting were biosecure. So what we do is we work with a number of nurseries. At the minute, it's about 34, and they have an annual audit that helps Woodland Trust to have confidence that their practices in the nursery are biosecure. And we also have a policy that those trees at no stage in their lifespan can have been imported. So from seed to sapling, they've always been grown in the UK, which is hence the name, or Ireland, sorry, UK and Ireland sourced and grown. And you'll be hearing after me from Adam from Moor Trees, who is a UKISG assured nursery. So he'll be able to delve a bit more into the detail of what that means in practice on the ground. Yeah, so I think we can go to the next slide, please, Sam. It's a plant healthy accreditation certification scheme. This is relatively recent, so it was about 2019 that this was birthed. It's industry led and government backed. Again, it's sort of it's done by an annual audit on the nursery. This actually comes with a cost associated to the nursery, and I should have mentioned UKISG, the Woodland Trust funds the cost, so it doesn't cost the nursery anything to be accredited UKISG, but Plant Healthy does. And the aim of this is to sort of make trade in plants more biosecure. So it's widely recognised that one of the major pathways of spreading pests and diseases is through trade in plants and movement of live plants. So what this does is try to implement steps at each stage in the supply chain to make it more biosecure. And this, importantly, this is effective across the whole sector. So whilst UKISG is only effective to trees, Plant Healthy is effective across the whole sector. So commercial nurseries, plant retailers, different landscape businesses and public gardens. So it is wider in scope than UKISG is. And should just mention that the government are actually they're changing their procurement from June this year. So any government funding for planting trees, they will need to see evidence that those trees have been sourced from a nursery that has biosecurity credentials. And that can be delivered by either Plant Healthy accreditation or something called a FERA ready to plant certificate. So there are two options, but it is very likely to drive interest in Plant Healthy. So you might see that scheme becoming a bit more popular in the next year or so. Just to very quickly mention GB Plant Biosecurity Strategy, this was a consultation at the end of last year that DEFRA led. Woodland Trust responded in full to this, and we actually had a public campaign at the same time, and we had over 1,000 responses to that, which really shows that there is interest in a really technical topic. It's got a 5-year scope, so it will run through, when it's published in a matter of weeks, actually, it will run through to 2027, and it will set out government's new vision for plant health, and definitely will be the main avenue for all biosecurity policy. Woodland Trust, we had several major policy asks, but I've just extracted a few here. So we really want government to acknowledge that imports are a significant part of the problem. We'd really like to see investment in our domestic nursery sector. So I mentioned earlier the international trade that we have when it comes to plants, and that we really need to reverse that reliance on imports. And that's really relevant for the audience we have here today as well. It's brilliant that there are so many community tree nurseries, and hopefully more to be set up in the years ahead. We'd like to see improved and meaningful periods of quarantine. And what I mean by that is, if we know that a certain host species of a certain pest or disease can be symptomless for, say, 12 months, then we need to see them quarantined for 12 months where they are being imported, so that we can have confidence that they aren't spreading anything into the wider environment. And finally, we need to see a public communications plan, and that needs to be government-led. There's very little knowledge generally in plant health, and so government needs to really commit to increasing the knowledge of the public in this area, given it's such an important area to be discussing. So I'll summarize very quickly and sort of leave you with some takeaway messages. So tree pests and diseases and their awareness is really important. Pests and diseases threaten our ability to meet climate targets, because if a tree pests and diseases take hold, it can lead to like sort of anything up to 80–90% of that tree species needing to be felled, which of course is not great at a time when we're needing to be increasing our woodland cover. The arrival of pests and diseases can have a really lasting impact on our landscape. So we've seen this with ash trees and ash dieback, and elm trees and Dutch elm disease. So it's having a really dramatically change in the landscape that the UK would otherwise have. International plant trade carries a really high risk, and that risk needs to be mitigated by reducing our reliance on trade. There we go. And the final one. Next click, please, Sam. Thank you. Each and every individual has a role to play and can make a difference. The collective sort of input of lots of different people will make the UK a more biosecure place. So it's really important that everybody's implementing where they can. Thank you. That's everything from me. And I will pass back to Hilary now, I think.
Yes, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, full of information. Obviously, as Alisha said, the slides will be circulated, and there will be chance for further discussion and questions after Adam has done his talk. So I'm just going to introduce you to Adam Owen. Some of you will have met him before on one of our events. He is director of Moor Trees, which is based in Dartmoor, a very large established community tree nursery. And he's basically going to give an outline of Moor Trees' experience of working with UKISG, which is UK and Island Sourced and Grown assurance scheme that Alisha was just talking about there. So I'll just hand over to you now, Adam, if you're ready to carry on.
Yeah, thank you very much, and hello to everybody. Hope you're having a great evening. So my bit was really to try and perhaps bring some confidence to some of you who may be thinking of going into UKISG, but maybe a bit concerned about it being admin heavy, or you needing to sort of put your tree nursery through certain steps to attain the assessment. And I just wanted to reassure you that it really isn't that intensive at all. And we supply trees to the Woodland Trust, and we also receive grant funding from the Woodland Trust. So they've been really supportive of us. And they requested about 4 years ago that we joined in with the UKISG audit. And what that means is you get sent an audit report, which is pre-filled with questions. And I'm just going to show you that by doing a screen share, and then I'm going to screen share some various documents with you, and we'll go from there. So Sam, if you could just enable screen sharing for me, that'd be great.
That's done.
Thank you very much. Okay, so fingers crossed, you should all be seeing this screen, which shows the audit report for 2021. Yep, grand. I'll take a nod of heads as that's working. So what happens is we get sent this audit report for us to then pre-fill before the audit actually happens. So we will receive this a couple of months before the physical audit takes place on the site. Now we've had 4 audits, we know what to expect. But that very first time, there was good communications with the Woodland Trust, and they went through the audit with us page by page so we could understand what it was that we needed to do. Now you say we're a large tree nursery. I suppose we're a reasonably large community tree nursery, but we're certainly not large by commercial standards. And for us, initially, it was quite daunting, but once we'd done it, it was quite simple. So there's just saying who we are, where we are, who the inspector's name is going to be, and then they're quite interested in the background of the tree nursery, with the staff, how many trees are being produced, how long they've been operating, how large it is. So very simple information to fill in. Background to your organization. And again, you know, that didn't take us too long to complete that because we know who we are. And then we move on to more of the evidence. So some of that evidence that they want to see is what's called FRM. Now, the reason you would become UKISG is because you are choosing to supply trees retail or wholesale to individuals or industry. And at that point, that's when you need to do the FRM, which is the forestry reproductive materials, and comply with those regulations. I'm going to come on to that in a little bit longer, in a little bit of time. But again, quite simply, they just want to see that you are following that process, and you've got the certificates, and you can demonstrate your paper trail. And there you can see, just fill in. Do you do it? Yes. Okay. No action required. It's not really that complex. When they come on the day, they want to see that paper trail, whether that's electronic or whether it is in paper, and go through it, and they'll talk about your processes, but it's definitely not arduous at all. They're then interested, as I said, in seeing that evidence. So your certificates, your records, collection, and then any of your internal stock movements. So where your seeds come from, where it's been in the tree nursery once stock is growing, have you moved it around? Have you identified where those trees have moved about? And again, this is stuff that you will probably be doing anyway in your tree nursery, just so you know yourself where your trees are and where they're growing. So as long as you're recording that information, it's very simple to demonstrate that you're compliant. We don't do, as we're not registered organic, because obviously there's a fee in association with that, but we don't use any pesticides. So for us, this entire part of the document is just null and void, and that makes it very simple for us. And I imagine a lot of community tree nurseries as well won't be using any pesticides. In terms of here, again, with regards to any fertilizers, insecticides, fungicides, disease outbreaks, again, we're not using any of those things. But one things that we do, and again, your community tree nursery, I'm sure you're doing it, is you're walking around and looking at the health of your trees. And if you're seeing something, you're making a note of it or writing it down. As I say, it might be rusts or powdery mildews, it might be mammal damage. And again, as long as you're keeping that record, and the recommendation is you might do your check as you're there weekly, but really you should perhaps record something every month, and record what you've seen, what your actions are. But also what's important is to put what's called a nil return. So if you don't see anything, make sure that you've identified that you didn't see anything. So it's and for us, that's just a simple Excel spreadsheet, and we have a piece of paper, and then we copy it over onto an Excel spreadsheet with just the date and what we saw and what action we've taken. We don't get involved in plant passports, but we do put biosecurity notices up, and again I will show you some of those, because again they're really simple and they're just sort of templates that we copied. And one of the big things in terms of biosecurity, and it was something that Alisha mentioned, was that the boot wash, and that's probably the most important thing. And what was quite interesting was a number of the inspectors over the years have said, we've got better boot wash facilities than some of the commercial tree nurseries they go to, which is amazing because all it is a bucket full of disinfectant and a brush. And I'll show you again some pictures. It's not rocket science, but it's something that we encourage any visitors that come into our tree nurseries just to do boot wash at the gate as they come in. And again, a policy associated with biosecurity, so a biosecurity statement. If you're buying any stock in, and we do buy stock in occasionally because we grow 20 native broadleaf species, and sometimes a customer who will be doing a larger order for may want something that we don't have the right numbers for, or it may be a species that we don't actually grow. So we will go and purchase that from a local tree nursery, and what we have to do is then put that into a quarantine area. And again, that's very simply just an area of the nursery that's set aside for putting those trees when they come into site, so they're completely separate from any of your other trees. They don't get mixed at any point with any of your other trees until your batch leaves the nursery and goes off to the customer. So it's just having an identifiable site for that. And you know, our quarantine area in our tree nurseries, and we've been putting out about 15,000 through the gate every winter. Our quarantine area is probably no more than sort of 5 meters by 5 meters. It's a very small area indeed. And here we're not within a nitrate vulnerable zone, and we don't have a problem because we're also not bringing, other than the quarantine stuff, we're not bringing plants into site. We're bringing seed into site, and then we're processing those seeds and growing the trees within the site. So there's very little risk, actually no risk of bringing in soil on the roots of trees, for example, that we're then bringing into the tree nursery and mixing it up. We don't use peat, so there's no problem with there. And we don't have any water abstraction. If we did, then we'd demonstrate a license for it, but we do rainwater capture just off the roofs of some buildings, or where we have some mains water, we also use mains water when we need to, if we're running dry. Alisha talked about the oak processionary moth. This is simply because it's a very significant disease, and they just want to know whether or not it's present. So that's one of the ones that's identified, and that is the end of it. So you can see it's actually quite a simple process to go through. That's the actual audit form, and we've done that now 4 times. We're in our 5th year, and we've passed every time, which is great. So just to show you, I'm not going to go through the wordings, but a biosecurity policy. You know, I got in touch with another nursery and basically just cribbed theirs, and it's just a side of A4. It's not some big document which you know you have to paste all over the place. This is just a policy that we have, and we've got it up on the wall, so if people want to see it, they can see it, but it could be certainly in the folder, and you just make people aware. But really, this is just so people have something to refer to, and it's putting in good practice for the nursery. We have signs, and these are the signs that we have at the gates, just to remind people it's we value plant biosecurity, and just asking them to use boot wash, and a sign right next to the boot wash, and very simple stuff. This is part of the boot wash. It's a brush, some gloves. People want to put gloves on because of the disinfectant that's used, and then I'm just going to move that over there. And this is the boot wash. It's Vicron, which is an agricultural disinfectant. We just mix it up and put fresh batch in, and go from that. And that is our really very simple biosecurity measure. You know, really high tech stuff, which is great, brilliant. In terms of FRM, the forest reproductive materials, again, people can be quite concerned by this, and it's not. Again, I would say it's not something that's very significant. It's an important part of what we do, but it doesn't take a lot of administration time, simply because one of the things is we're dealing with native broadleaf trees, We're only dealing with seed. And whilst there are many species on that list, a lot of our native broadleaf species that we grow aren't on the list for compulsory FRM. They're there for volunteer, but they're what you would expect, what you would call forest trees. You know, the Forestry Commission has grown. So ash was on there, but we can't do ash anyway. But things like beech, our cherry, oak, birch, alder, aspen, hornbeam. So they're on it. But other things like hawthorn, rowan, field maple, they're not on it. And what we do is we fill one of these in. They've gone to an online system for the first time this year, but this is sort of an example of the paper one that we used in last year. And we're just saying who we are and where we're getting our seed and when. And you send that off 2 weeks before, and it's an identification that you're going to intend to collect seed. Now, when I showed this to the last inspector, he just thought, wow, you do that really well. You know, why not just put down you're going to collect, and then just in one column, just list all the tree species that you're going to collect, list the sites in this column, and then just say you're going to collect it between October, you know, and December or something. And that was the FRM guide for the Forestry Commission. So I thought, wow, thank you, because he's just made our life simpler for 2022. Because all they want is the information. And when we get back and we've processed the seed and we've got trees growing, we've got a very simple bed plan. So these are all bare root beds and root trainers and so forth, and we just have it written in what we have growing there. So we've come up with our own codes internally, quite simple. It's the species, it's the 3 letters or 2 letters for the site location, and then the year the seed was collected, and then how many we've got growing in those beds. And as they move, we update the board, taking a photograph of the board each time it changes. So we've got that ongoing record. So it doesn't have to be high tech at all. It can be really, really simple stuff like this. And they're very happy with that system. And then when we have collected our seeds, the ones that we've applied, done a notification, so the seeds that come under the FRM regs, once we've got the dry weight of that seed, we then send off another form, and ultimately we will get back this master seed certificate. So this one here is for Prunus avium, which is the wild cherry. It just says where we collected it from and what the region and provenance is, the UK, and how much of it we collected. And that is the official number at the top there for this certificate. And again, this is only because we're supplying retail and wholesale trees. If you're not going to do that and you're just going to give them away, you don't need to be doing this. But as we are supplying, what we need to do is we need to give the people that are receiving our trees this document. And it looks complex, but again, it's very simple to do. It's very simple to tick the boxes. And once you get your head around it, we know all of our seed comes from 305. We know all of our tree species. So we just have most of these pre-formatted, and then we just delete the rows and columns we don't want. And so it's quite straightforward, you know, and that goes with the tree. So we email this to the customer who's purchased the trees from us, and that's the end of the process. So long as you can demonstrate that, and they'll guide you through it, UKISG is a nice, simple process that gives assurance to the customers, as well as obviously to the Woodland Trust, that you're as biosecure as you can be. And we find now in Devon, almost all of our customers are asking about this, you know, are the trees local provenance, you know, what are you doing about pest and disease and so forth. And it's great to be able to show them that we are an UKISG. We are going to have to move towards plant healthy, because I think that's going to become pretty compulsory for tree nurseries, no matter what size they are, if they want to sell into the market. But again, it's personally, I don't see it as a negative. I can see it only as a positive to strengthen the UK tree nursery industry. That's me.
Thanks, Adam. That's really useful. Right. Now we can invite those of you who'd like to ask questions directly to our guest speakers. to raise your hand, and I know there's some in the chat already, some questions appearing, which is great. So I just have I think some of them have been answered already, actually. Anyone would like to ask a direct question to start us off? Paula from Chichester?
Yes, please. Trying not to give away the fact that I am watching this by lying on the floor, but hey ho. For Alisha, please could we have a recommended planning condition for sourcing UK grown trees? Because I'm just conscious that we have a strategic development near us, and they're ever so proud. They've been planting, or they're intending to plant 8,000 trees, and they've got a new country park right next to a fragment of ancient woodland. And not all of the trees that they've planted in this country park are UK grown, because I was looking at labels and I'm a bit horrified, really. And if we could possibly persuade our planning authorities to adopt some best practice conditions when they are giving permission for developments like this, then hopefully the developers would deliver and actually know that they had to fulfill that condition.
Thanks, Paula. It's a really good point, and this is something we're looking to sort of increase moving forward at the Woodland Trust, sort of demand and supply for UKISG. So it's a really important area for us. We want to see more commitment from other organisations to deliver, including sort of local authority level as well, regionally, because of the sort of pressing issue that we have with imported tree diseases. So we are hoping to get additional resource in the next sort of year or so at the Woodland Trust to focus on UKISG at the minute as well. So hopefully in the next you'll see some movement in this space in the future, and there will be sort of external commitment for UKISG as well. But at the minute I don't think there's sort of no requirements at the regional level to source domestic trees. But it's certainly something we're looking at.
Yeah, so I'm just thinking that as somebody who would potentially respond to planning applications, I'm a volunteer tree warden, and I suspect that there's a chunk of other people here who are too. But throughout the networks, we as individuals could say to our planning authority, I know somebody, when one of the umpteen reserve matters things we're going through for this, asked for hedgehog highways and got them. In the same way, particularly I'm thinking on this site was really sensitive. I could have made, if I'd had some wording that came from a reputable source like the Woodland Trust that says we recommend this, then I could have bunged that into the councillors and the planning committee and said, we really, really need this. And I could have stood up at planning committee if needed. And it would be a way of persuading, even if there isn't an obligation, by having the wording that we could suggest was good practice.
I think that's a really helpful offer, actually, and something that we can look to explore, because if there's more people on the ground that sort of are lobbying for this at a community regional level, that would definitely help the cause. So I will take that away and sort of think about how we could explore that further at Woodland Trust, and maybe develop some lines on it that we can sort of try to get support from people like you in different areas that would be able to then go and do that.
That's brilliant, thank you.
Thanks for that brilliant question, Paula. Alan Cookson, did you want to, I see you've got a question in the chat, would you like to ask it?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Oh, okay, so I'm not very Zoom proficient, to be honest with you. Yeah, my question is both to Alisha and Adam, and it's regarding forestry materials and FRM7s and FRM4s, and whether or not Alisha thinks it's wise for, is it not the case that all CIC groups should be following forestry reproductive material regulations, because are we not in danger of causing larger biohazard, biosecurity by having people? Adam said when he was talking, CIC is just giving trees away, so therefore you don't need to do FRM registration, notification of intention to collect seed, or master certification application because you're just going to give the trees away. Isn't that a greater biosecurity threat than anything else? We have CICs stomping around woodlands, collecting seed, ad hoc, and then growing it on. So I run a tree nursery in Mid Wales, and I'm UKISG approved. And then south of me in Brecon, we have Stump Up for Trees projects, which is a plan to plant 1 million trees in the Brecon Beacons. And I regularly see them receiving trees and tree material, tree seed, which all, of course, these things shouldn't be sent around the country. It's APA, it's against the Animal Plant Health Agency regulations to post plant materials without plant passports. But there's a lot of activity going on within CIC groups which involve plant materials, tree seed and trees being moved ad hoc around the country without any FRA registration, no notification to collect seed, no follow-up for master certification. And Adam sort of said, you don't need to do this if you're just giving your trees away. Are we in danger of creating more biosecurity by sort of letting people stomp around the world, stomp around the countryside, collecting tree seed, growing seed, without any of it being registered whatsoever?
I'll pass over to Adam on that. I don't know that much about FRM requirements and regulation. All I would say is that I would suggest all CICs are following the best practice and regulation advised by AFA. So if that is a requirement, then it will be something that's needed. But Adam knows a lot more about this than I do, so I'll let Adam come back on this one.
Hi. Yeah, I agree with everything you've just said there, Alan, and it's something that I would advocate anybody who is moving plant material or growing trees should go down the route of FRM. But then I understand, there's sort of a historic formal process that was started back in the 70s, and it was done principally because it was to do with large commercial tree nurseries dealing with plant materials for the forest sector. And that's why it focuses on those trees that traditionally foresters grow, for timber production and for harvesting. And so there is also why there is a huge raft of our native trees which are just come under the voluntary scheme and don't come under the compulsory scheme. So it is historic, and it is out of date, because community tree nurseries, are setting up at a pace all around the country, and this is something that, in conversations that I've had with the Forestry Commission, and they are looking at to see how it can be restructured potentially. And then you've also got these other schemes coming in that we've mentioned. Plant Healthy. Plant Healthy is quite a heavy scheme for a large commercial tree nursery, and they're concerned that community tree nurseries will just ignore it, basically, because there's actually quite a lot of cost associated with Plant Healthy. So DEFRA Shared Outcomes is an initiative that we've been involved with, and they're trying to design Plant Healthy Light for community tree nurseries. So there is work going on to try and encourage anybody who's going to be growing trees to maximize basically their biosecurity. But at the moment, what I've explained is the framework that we're working in. But I completely do understand your concerns, most definitely. I think one of the things that was interesting talking to the Forestry Commission was they were quite confident if you're growing native broadleaf trees and you picked those native broadleaf plants up, locally, and you're distributing them locally, that actually the biosecurity risk is really low. On the percentage scale of risk, it is really, really low. It's bringing stuff in from overseas, it's moving things, that perhaps you've got host plants, so you've got some plants which could be household plants or could be lower form plants which will host a disease which that can then jump into other trees within a commercial nursery setting. because those commercial nurseries just aren't dealing with trees quite often, they're dealing with lots of other types of plants as well. So that's really where a lot of the focus has been, but that's my understanding of it and my take on it.
Thanks, Adam. Did you want to add anything to that, Alan, or does that make things clearer for you?
It's not really. It's not something that I have an issue with regards to clarity on. It's just, I mean, particularly, I'd like to say, Adam, I mean, my overriding concern really is regarding to fire blight and rowan and the spread of that. And we have this. Without forestry reproductive material registration of notice to collect seed, without animal plant health agency regulations being followed with regards to the movement of all of these plant materials, is that we, from a biosecurity point of view, are spreading UK-born tree diseases further and further afield. So, and it's not. It's just. It is more Adam's comment about the, you know, we don't. You can give as long as you're giving your trees away, you don't have to follow forestry reproductive materials regulations, and to not follow forestry reproductive material regulations. What's the point in doing it? What's the point in Adam doing it? If there's thousands of people up and down the country who are not doing it, without that track with the FRM7 of notification to collect seed, without the FRM4 for to apply for master certification, we are, you know, it's you've got people that are trying to do this from a commercial sense, who have to follow all of these regulations, and then community groups being told, don't worry about it, do whatever you want, and it sort of it undoes that I do, and it undoes everything that Adam does. If community groups aren't actually stipulated that you have to follow the forestry reproductive materials guideline regulations to, I mean, this is what the UKISG itself refers back to. It refers back to, can I see your notification to collect seed? Can I see your master certifications? There's no point in having UKISGs. I mean, no CIC is going to get a UKISG if they have followed the FRM. So we can't have a situation where CICs, all with best intentions, are just growing trees ad hoc without any FRM notification to collect seed, without any FRM. They're not going to get UKISG, and they're undermining potentially everything that I'm doing and everything that Adam's doing inside the boundaries of all the legislation that's set up about biosecurity for trees. That's my point. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Alan, for that very, very valuable contribution. Rachel, would you do you want to add to that, or have you got a separate question?
I've got a separate question. I'd like to go back to what Alisha was saying about elm and ash earlier on this evening. So could you recap on the bit about the hedgerow trees seem to have survived more?
Yeah, sure. So I believe it's something to do with the bark beetles needing the trees to be a certain size before they're actually attracted to them. And it's the bark beetle that leads to the fungus infection within the elm tree. So a lot of the hedgerow trees have actually survived because they're kept at a certain size, whereas obviously trees in the wider landscape or trees out in the woodlands are able to grow a lot larger. So I believe the advice actually with hedgerow trees is it might be favourable if there are elm trees within a hedgerow to keep them trimmed to really prevent them from having Dutch elm disease take hold of them,
okay.
Which I think is quite interesting. I don't know if any of you sort of follow farming sort of the farming sector at all in any way, but a lot of the thinking currently is about sort of growing bigger and wider hedgerows to really capture carbon and deliver for biodiversity. So it's just, that's just one example, I think, of where sometimes we can have quite contradicting actually environmental outcomes based on different advice. So with elm trees, the advice is to keep them trimmed, to stop Dutch elm disease taking hold, but actually that goes against capturing more carbon in the hedgerow. So yeah, it's very complicated.
So the other reason why I'm asking is because I've found some wych elm locally that are ones growing within a forestry commission plantation, and I know from I've known that plantation for over 30 years, and I know that when they cut the trees down, they cut everything down. So as far as I'm concerned, if I'm salvaging things from that area, then it's just going to be destroyed otherwise anyway. So my question is do you think it's okay for me to collect wych elm seeds from where I find them in the wild, and also ash trees? Is it okay to collect seed from wych elm and ash?
So I would need to go away and sort of look at in more detail around the Woodland Trust position on sort of seed collection. I don't really know that much about it, so I wouldn't feel comfortable advising you at this point, but I can certainly take that away and come back to you. I know we don't plant any ash in our species mixes anymore, so it's not a species that the Woodland Trust are sort of focused on planting, and a lot of the focus with ash is sort of the hope of resistance is really reliant on leaving infected ash trees standing, so which isn't always practical if there are sort of health and safety considerations and it's near a footpath, for example, the ash tree might need to come down. But the Woodland Trust focus is on sort of finding resistance in standing ash trees rather than replanting ash trees. So I will definitely take that away and come back to you on that, Rachel, if that's all right, if you can provide a contact detail for me to do that.
Thank you so much. James, I noticed you got a few questions in the chat. Did you want to ask them directly?
Hi, yeah, thanks. Sorry, I've inundated the chat with questions here. Just as a bit of background, I've looked at the Plant Healthy. There's some online advice sheets and tutorials you can do with the Plant Healthy scheme. They're free to access. And I must admit, following the FRM regulations, that seems to very much to me about traceability, but not so much about biosecurity in terms of advice of what you're looking for and what to watch out for and how to combat it. But when you go onto the Plant Healthy, that's much more informative about biosecurity, the pests and diseases individually, how to watch out for them. So these are actually questions left over from, I had a workshop with Alistair from Plant Healthy. And he actually came across to my Community Tree Nursery, but I wondered, this is for Adam and Alisha, if you've got any answers for these questions. It may be unfair that I'm asking of these of you, because I've got a fellow CTN here, and also we've got the Woodland Trust as almost kind of an end user. But when it comes to Phytophthora, do you know what plant or shrub we can use as an early volunteer indicator? Because some species don't show symptoms of Phytophthora, and you can't see it with your naked eye. Is there a particular kind of plant we should plant in the nursery to show up Phytophthora?
Across the Woodland Trust estate, it's mainly we're dealing with it on sweet chestnut and larch, but that's I don't know an answer to your specific question, but I know sort of on the Woodland Trust they're the species that are causing us to manage them from Phytophthora remorum. That is, was it okay. Phytophthora remorum or pluvialis that you were?
Remorum, yeah. Adam, any thoughts on that one? Have you come across that one?
I haven't, in terms of like growing an indicator plant that you would sort of see the signs on initially, but Phytophthora generally, as I understand it, they mainly move faster with regards to water, and you know that's sort of how they translocate. we've been asked to do what's called a water bait test. So if we have any standing water in a site, whether it be in a rainwater harvesting container or a pond or something like that, then we would do an annual water bait test, which is just to check whether there's a phytophthora presence in the water. But again, there are multiple phytophthora, as I'm sure you're aware. So I don't know of any indicator plant for a particular one. No, I've not heard that. It's interesting actually. So perhaps something to consider. But one of the things with the rainwater harvesting, that's where, because we need quite a lot of water, I have linked them all up, because if I had separate buckets, I was told I would have to do a water bait test for each separate bucket. So I've linked them in series, so I only have to do one. So if you're thinking of doing a lot of rainwater collecting, then that might be something to consider as well. But no, sorry, I can't answer that directly.
Okay, and the water bait test you do for Phytophthora, is that basically a lateral flow test that we're all familiar with now?
I guess, yeah, I guess that's a neat way of putting it. But you've got to take, but the lateral flow test is like a home test, I suppose. Whereas the water bait test, you send it away, so
to a lab.
So it's more like a PCR test.
Okay, fine. Because at this seminar with Plant Healthy as well, that he showed us this. It's literally a lateral flow test, and I never would have known what one of these was 3 years ago. But it tests for Phytophthora. Do you do any testing with those kind of things, or you just do lab testing?
So we just started doing the lab tests because we hadn't done it before. We were asked to do it. So we've just set up our rainwater harvesting, because we were sort of watering from individual rain butts, which is why I then consolidated them all. So it's a new one for us as well.
Okay, I'm just going to rattle through my other questions, if I may, just keep hold of the mic. So when you're looking at the Plant Healthy scheme, they talk about an appropriate level of protection, ALOP. If you get into this, you'll get very familiar with that term. And so I just wondered if anybody could say what an appropriate level of protection is for a small community tree nursery that does about 1,000 trees a year. How should we be checking things to check outgoing plants? Do we just do a visual inspection throughout the year, like you were saying, Adam, with periodic reviews to see if anything is looking ill, or is there anything we should be looking for when we're actually at the point of giving out trees?
So Emma Cross, who I mentioned with the shared outcomes, looking at this Plant Healthy Light, they're introducing some training which Moor Trees is going to engage with in June. So at the moment, I can't answer it because I don't know.
Okay, no, that's fine. These questions have actually been sent off to, I think it's the Forest Research, but that was last year. I'm still waiting to hear back from this. I just wondered if I'd get any luck here. And Adam, you will be able to answer this one for me. When you get visitors that come along without welly boots on, and they might have trainers or hiking boots which are non-Gore-Tex, how do you deal with them?
They put their foot in the bath.
They get wet foot.
Yeah, well, I mean, I put my flip-flops in if I go up in my flip-flops. Well, there we are. Yeah. But in essence, yeah, the whole boot doesn't have to go ankle deep. It really is just what you're carrying in your treads. So brush off for the sort of the excess mud, if you will. It's quite interesting. There are a number now of our volunteers who have tree nursery footwear, so they will come and then they'll put those boots on and just use them in the tree nursery, which I think is pretty good as well. But yeah, not had a problem. I think the only challenge I had was when we had some school kids come up, some teenagers, and they definitely didn't want to put their fashion shoes into the water bath. But other than that, most people get on with it.
Okay, last one, I promise. As community tree nursery people here, we're going to be really interested in going out and collecting seeds and nuts and things. Any advice on what the top 3 things we could do to reduce risks of transporting disease? I've heard that seeds and nuts are basically a low risk material. So if you pick them up, it's low risk. But is there anything that we should all be doing to reduce? What's the most impact we can do with like the top best things we could do to reduce risks?
So for us, in terms of seed collecting, it's about reducing risk, but it's also about genetic variation. So it's collecting from different trees, individual trees in different sites as well. So that is about genetic variation. But equally, you know, if you're picking something up within one site, then you're reducing that probability of risk, if you will. And as I say, we've always been encouraged to hear that seeds, particularly native British seeds, are generally the lowest of the scale in terms of biosecurity risk. And a seed by its very nature is, because it's sort of cocooned, if you will, from the outside world. But that's that in essence is it. You know, we don't do heat treatments or anything like that either. So we just do cold stratification, and we do processing. So we'll remove the flesh off certain things and abrade hard seeds and stuff like that. But yeah, from our perspective, I mean, fingers crossed, but in 20 years, we've not had anything other than what you would expect, some powdery mildew and some rusks. So I'm quite confident that we're all okay if we're collecting it. I think if you had, you know, there have been instances, obviously in Cornwall, there's one recently of Phytophthora plantation, you know, where they had to go in and do a clear felling of larch. And I think if you're aware of the sites like that, or you're aware of sites, you know, that have sweet chestnuts, which one was it? Sorry, it's gone out of my head. At least you mentioned it. But you know, if you're aware of sites with that, then don't collect in those sites. It's quite simple. Or adjacent to those sites, go elsewhere.
Lovely, thank you.
Thanks, James. Paula, did you have another question?
Afraid so. So much like Jane in the comments, there's a tendency around here is that people have baby trees and they want to hand them on and they want to find places for them. Those baby trees come with the soil in which they've been planted. And also from a personal perspective, if I'm looking for acorns and things, and if I have landowners' permission, my inclination might be to want to take some of the soil floor to plant with them to try and encourage the right mycorrhizae for the trees to grow healthily and happily. That's quite different to what Adam is doing, and I'm wondering what we should be doing or how we should be thinking in terms of things like soils, mulch. Again, I'm thinking of potentially getting permission to take acorns and a little bit of an ancient woodland floor without damaging. Obviously, you damage where you go, but just do a tiny bit to effectively start these particular trees off, because that's the soil in which I wouldn't have the right soil, but I could maybe give them a dose and hope that they will grow better.
Okay. Yeah, I hear exactly what you're saying, and it's a question we get asked a lot. And my answer has to be, because we're UKISG, we can't accept live plant material. So we do get people who wish to make donations. You know, they've collected acorns from the garden, they've grown them on, they're 1-2 years old, and they want to give them to us. And it's a really difficult one, because you want to be compliant, but at the same time, you know, even personally, I could look at that and go, well, I know exactly where that tree's got, you know, those acorns have come from. I know that I can pinpoint the actual garden. You know, we could do an FRM report if we wanted to say, you know, the seed has come from that place. But it's just, I think we're in this place at the moment with the rise of community tree nurseries and CICs and so forth, and local initiatives to grow trees, that actually regulations haven't caught up yet. And I know there's, from conversations, as I say, I've had with the Forest Commission, you know, from what Alisha's saying tonight, I think there's a lot of work going on in the background in DEFRA to try and come to some reasonable solution to that. But I don't have the answer. And I think I shouldn't say here publicly for the Woodland Trust something like, oh well, whatever, because it's, you know, I can understand there are loads of communities around us, loads of villages collecting local seeds and growing them on and planting them out in local hedgerows. But again, this is why I made that distinction earlier between sort of what you do if you're selling and supplying as to what you do if you're donating. It's not ideal. But,
yeah, I think we also, traceability, knowing about plant passports, which I wouldn't need to know. So we're at the point where we've got an allotment patch that's been given planning permission. The allotment doesn't exist yet. And there's that sense of how the hell do we do this responsibly? And by modeling it, how do we encourage people and how do we do the right thing? So this is very much fact finding for me, but it comes up all the time. And when you're not expert on it, when you've just got a bit of a clue. I mean, silly things like mulch. Where am I allowed to get mulch from? To keep moisture in and to do stuff. It exercises me and I don't have the answers, and it's good to talk about it. So thank you.
Thank you, Paula. Chris, did you have a question? You need to unmute yourself, Chris.
Yeah. Right, let's go. Sorry about that. I've got a couple of questions. One is about the use of wood chips, because we don't know where the wood chips are sourced, what trees they're used, and they do tend to get a bit mouldy sometimes. I mean, what, Adam or Alicia, can we use wood chips, or do we have to record everything if we take part in the UKISG audit?
Adam will probably know better than I will the details of it. If not, I can take it away as an action and come back to you on that, Chris.
It'd be good, Alisha, actually, yeah, if you could. The thing within the UKISG is, are you peat free or not?
Yes, your peat's
no, so it's not to say where do you get your wood chip. And we have, if we're buying in compost, we will usually make sure that it's sterilized compost, simply because we don't want lots and lots of weeds coming in. So it's gone through a hot composting cycle, it's got a certificate, it's past 100, something like that. So, but that primarily is because we don't want all the weeds coming up and causing us more work. We have used wood chip as mulch, you know, and we've been in touch with local tree surgeons, and we just asked, it's hardwood, that wood chippings that we receive, and it's not evergreen just because the nutrient value within it. And we also, Daryl, who's our tree nursery officer, he's started to do no dig methods now. So there'll be a lot more being added on of sort of cardboard and mulch, and then planting through that to enrich the soils. Because, you know, we've had our 2 tree nurseries running, I think, about 13 years at these same sites, and we've been growing trees in the same beds, and the soil does get tired. So we're looking to do more restorative growing processes. But in terms of, I don't think UKISG specifies anything on that. It is just whether or not you're peat free. And I would say, if you know a good source of compost or wood chip, you know, that has been produced and ideally hot composted, then you'll be all right.
Okay, it looks like a risk, that's all. But whether the other thing is, I wonder if small trees, 1 and 2 year olds, do they pick up diseases? I thought it was mainly older trees.
Well, I think you know, you can certainly get things like the Phytophthora or Zyella and stuff like that in a nursery, in a plant nursery, and it can rip through your young stock and annihilate it. So you don't want it. But I mean, I don't have a huge amount of experience with tree diseases in a community tree nursery, because it just hasn't happened. So, you know, so I say growing over 20 years, we've got no record of any of these things happening in our community tree nurseries. And we have bought in purpose-made compost. We have bought it from a local composting initiative. And, you know, we've had wood chip coming from tree surgeons. And I feel for a lot of this stuff, you can talk it up and you can almost create a fear factor where you're never going to pick up an acorn and plant it for fear that, you know, you're going to cause the next disease to rip through the UK. And I really think that the risks are low. It's just about being reasonable. And I think if you're collecting local seed, you're growing it locally, and you're using local, you're either using a professional, you know, sterilized compost mulch, or you're using good local mulch, then you're all the time you're limiting the opportunity for that any disease to have come. If it's not in the area, why would it be there just because you go seed collecting in that wood? And, you know, and when you look again, a lot of the focus, and as Alisha was saying, a lot of this focus is on and a lot of our problems has come through international trade. And that's the biggie, if you will. And that's why when all of these schemes have been set up, that's been the principal target and focus, because we don't want another Dutch elm disease, we don't want another ash dieback situation. So I think it's easy to get concerned, overly concerned, if you will, about these matters and these factors, but there are, I think awareness is really important. So just doing the simple stuff, you know, good, keeping your tools clean, you know, keeping your boots clean, being careful about your movement of plant material, i.e. getting things seed locally, and growing things locally, and then putting them back out into the local environment. And those things would minimize it all. But
I would just echo that, really, that I think if you're already doing it domestically, then you're mitigating a lot of the risk from sort of international means, and which is a major pathway of introducing a lot of pests and diseases. So long as you're implementing good biosecurity, which will be default by being involved in something like UKISG or even Plant Healthy, then you're already doing a lot towards making it more biosecure. So I agree with that, that like there's only a certain amount we can do and still produce trees that to mitigate those impacts. There will always be some risk associated with it, and you can mitigate that by remaining as local as you can, for example, when you're seed collecting, and doing all the biosecurity practices that I mentioned earlier as well. But I think it's not something that should be so worrying that people don't want to sort of try and produce trees here, because we really need to increase domestic capacity so that we can reduce that reliance on imports.
Thank you, both of you. Louise, we've got time for a couple more questions. Louise, would you like to go first?
Hi, can you hear me? Great. No, wasn't too sure I knew how to do this. Right. My question is that I'm a volunteer with a local community tree planting and growing group. So I collect seeds like acorns and horse chestnuts and grow them in my back garden until they're ready to plant up somewhere that we've found somewhere to locate them. However, I've also got 3 ash trees in my back garden, mature ash trees. And I'm not so sure, but I've got a sneaky feeling they might have ash dieback in them. But as ash trees are, they drop their keys all over the place. I've got them all over my garden. They get into all my soil. And what I have been doing up until now is actually mixing my garden soil with compost to grow my seeds. And of course, now I'm thinking, maybe I shouldn't have been doing that, because I don't know how the fungus is spread, whether it's just in the air or is it in the soil. So what's best practice for that? So if somebody can answer that. It doesn't also help that even if my ash trees don't have ash dieback, I was a conservation trainee with Dieback a couple of years back, and part of my job with them was to go into their woodlands and fell trees that have been affected by ash dieback. and we weren't told to disinfect our boots or anything either. So I could have brought it back as well on my boots, I hate to say. So please, can you give me some advice on what I should do on all that now? Oh, and also if you can advise what kind of disinfectant just the general public could use as well, that'd be really good.
So on the disinfectant, there's something called Clean Kill, which is really good, but I must stress, do only use it if you are visiting somewhere where you know it's suffering from some sort of disease, like I mentioned earlier, like a phytophthora or something like that, because we don't want to be sort of spraying disinfectant where we don't need to. But Clean Kill is a really sort of good one for when you're visiting woodlands. Your first question around ash dieback. So to be honest, I wouldn't worry about whether you brought it back. I mean, we're beyond the point with ash dieback of ever sort of maintaining areas that don't have ash dieback, because it spreads so quickly. In 10 years, it's sort of it's everywhere. So it's not about that. There's no sort of focus in this country now, in the UK as a whole, on preventing its spread, because we're beyond that. So even if you didn't bring it back, it would probably have reached you anyway. It's so ferocious. So don't worry about that. I think with ash dieback, the focus, as I mentioned earlier, is just about trying to find that resistance, and with the hope of rebuilding ash populations in the future with the genetics from those resistant trees. So on the mixing your soil, I do know, well, it's my understanding that the fungal spores do remain in the soil as well. But what I don't know is whether there's any risk to other species. I wouldn't have thought so, but again, I can take that away and sort of ask my the science brains that I work with within the Woodland Trust, who's our conservation evidence advisor on tree health. So if that's helpful to you, I'm happy to write that down and come back to you on that.
Okay. I suppose the thing I'm also concerned about is that whilst it may not affect other species, if we are then transplanting those seeds, those chestnuts, the horse chestnuts, the acorns or whatever, with the soil that is infected into another area that has ash that isn't infected at the moment, I could contaminate that area with that fungus then, couldn't I?
Yes, in practice you could, but as I mentioned earlier, I think it's so widespread now that there's very little point on sort of focusing on not spreading ash dieback, because it is almost everywhere. So, but I'm not sure. What I'm not sure of is whether there would be risk sort of in transporting that soil. I would have thought so anyway, the topic that we've sort of just discussed quite widely. So I will take that away and come back to you. If you want to drop your contact detail in the chat, I'll make a note of that and sort of get the best advice for you.
Okay, fabulous. And it may be an idea for me to feed back to the community group that maybe we shouldn't be using any of our garden soil anyway, and just use compost that's already been sterilised. That's ideally, if it's donated to the group anyway, it's not a cost to anybody as well. That could be our biosecurity measures in place then, couldn't it?
Yeah, that might be a good way to move forward. If it's peat-free compost, that would be brilliant.
Of course, yes. Okay, that is lovely. Thank you very much for all that advice.
Thank you so much for all the questions. We've actually come to the end of the session now. So I noticed there were a few more in the chat. We'll save the chat and hopefully we can answer your questions as well. I will send a link to the recording to you in the next couple of days. It will be on the YouTube channel for the Fellowship of the Trees, where you can also watch all the other recorded webinars and nature talks that are on there. So do check out our YouTube channel. And I will also send links to you for those of you who might be interested in joining the collaborative. It's free to join. There's an online submission form, so I'll send a link to that as well in the email. Everyone that's registered on Eventbrite obviously will receive the same email. Thank you so much everyone for coming. Thank you Alisha very much. Thank you Adam, and wish you a good evening everybody.
Thank you everybody. Goodbye.